Roger Robinson has, since he helped President Reagan destroy the Soviet Union by waging economic warfare that cut off the cash flow that supported its threats to us, and in short order resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it wasn't overnight, but when they ran out of money, it was pretty much immediate, as he'll tell you. But ever since, he's been working on trying to figure out where are the Chinese cash flow sources. How are they doing the things that are threatening us? How are they making possible the ambitions of the hide and bide strategy that are even more alarmingly now out in the public? Because the current and not so cute General Secretary of the Communist Party, the fellow that President Trump persists in talking about as his good friend, Xi Jinping, he now talks pretty openly about us as being the enemy and his mission as being to supplant us as the world's dominant power. So it's no longer just kind of something that specialists ought to be thinking about, especially in light of what the coronavirus is teaching us about the capacity for evil in this regime and the direct threat that it poses to us as a people, I would argue as a civilization. We need to know, how are they financing this? I'm going to turn it over to Roger to answer that question with you. And I just want to say thank you very much for being here to hear about it. It's great to be with you.
Well, thank you, Frank, and all those that made this evening possible. We're delighted to be here. My sister's been living outside of Hillsborough in East Washington since 1972. So I've been a frequent visitor to your fair state and always enjoyed myself immensely. You know, going back to Frank's talk, which wasn't long ago, he was talking about the surveillance state, he was talking about the social credit scoring, he was talking about concentration camps, he was talking about equipment that makes that all possible, notably surveillance cameras that are visible atop the walls of those concentration camps every few meters. This firm is also engaged in facial recognition technology of the type that round up Tibetans at train stations for their own incarceration. And the name of this poster child of human rights abuses is Hampshire pike fishing. And I say it's become kind of a poster child because there's been, fortunately, a lot of mainstream press that has illuminated this issue. The Congress has taken it up on a bipartisan basis because the Uyghur camps are a throwback to a very dark time, as you can imagine. Fortunately, not death camps, but, as Frank mentioned, torturous to all involved, nonetheless. And one of the reasons that I'm here, and we came to New Hampshire, that is, the committee came earlier on, was to talk about not just some of the things that I'm going to get into in a moment, but also to talk about whether New Hampshire itself is implicated, unwittingly, in helping underwrite these kind of odious companies, PLA advanced weapons manufacturers, companies enabling egregious human rights abuses, companies that are constructing and militarizing China's illegal islands in the South China Sea, companies aiding and abetting the North Korean nuclear and missile programs that threaten the continental United States. known hackers that are constantly stealing the personal data of tens, hundreds of millions of Americans. But Hikvision has stood out. And all to the good, except for one natty detail. Wall Street didn't get the memo. Not one index, these passive investment vehicles, that I know of, with all that press, with all those onerous accusations and realities, not one has divested or shed the stock of Hikvision. Notably, MSCI, Emerging Market Index, MSCI All Country World Index, the FTSE Russell Emerging Market Index, and the list goes on. Not one. And you might ask, how can that be? Because they should have headed for the tall grass on that a good while ago. Well, they didn't, in part because of China's heavy-handedness. There's a Wall Street Journal editorial that MSCI, probably the chief offender in this category, although FTSE Russell may give them a run for their money. The Chinese wanted to get in these indexes in the worst way. Why? Because there's $12 trillion of funds under management in some of these. That is, investors that track the indexes and invest in exactly what's on that list. And the Chinese know that every time one of their companies is added to that list, it's instantly and through obligation, instantly purchased by those trillions of dollars of funds under management. What a racket. They go to the mainland Chinese markets, the Shenzhen and Shanghai exchanges. They load up on a couple of hundred Chinese companies to, quote, better reflect their standing in the emerging market portfolio. And they bring them back into the United States, into the portfolios of about 160, 180 million Americans, which is the total number of folks in our country that are in the capital markets. I'm not sure the exact figure, but it's got to be somewhere in that region. And they can skirt SEC regulations on disclosure and transparency, none of which is happening. They can skirt federal securities laws. There are no public company accounting requirements, the PCAOB, which is an independent auditing function set up by the United States that ensures that folks are telling the truth about the numbers to protect us, the average investor. Every American company has to go through that auditing process. Do any of the Chinese, any of the 1,000+ Chinese in our markets, have any of them been through that? No. Are any of them compliant with Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley and other securities laws that U.S. companies have to abide by, even though there may be grousing and unhappiness? It's the law. Not one Chinese company is compliant with these federal securities laws, and especially those purchased out of the A-share market and somewhat sluiced in to the portfolios of scores of millions of Americans. Which brings us full stop, full circle, to New Hampshire. Because the New Hampshire Public Employees Pension System is invested in Hikvision. All of you who are in the system are holding Hikvision stock, thereby funding and supporting the concentration camps and the facial recognition technology that is oppressing the Chinese people and these minorities. You know, you're holding AVIC. What do they do for a living? China Aviation. Well, they build submarine-launched ICBMs with 30 minutes flying time to American families. They build the JL-20, I think it is, one of China's most advanced fighters, aircraft. All their unmanned vehicles and other advanced weapon systems. China Mobile, not allowed, I mean, excluded from the US market for national security concerns. But it's deemed okay for the people of New Hampshire to invest in that stock. And the list goes on. Now, we've researched your public employees pension system quite clearly, and we have these names available for you, and we have the profile of who these companies really are. Something that MSCI never did, something that the asset managers who build so-called exchange-traded funds around these indexes, they never performed the kind of diligence we're talking about. They never looked at who these companies really are, what their subsidiaries do, whether they are sanctioned by the United States, many of which are, including Hikvision. Not only is Hikvision on the blacklist of the Department of Commerce that we're not able to do business with by law, but their parent company's on there for national security reasons as well. What? How did that end up in the average portfolios of hardworking folks from New Hampshire? Well, the answer is the same way it ended up in the other 47 states that we've found so far. Only 2 states in the Union. Again, we're not done. This is a very laborious, intensive research task. So we're still working it. But so far we've only found Tennessee and Nevada that doesn't have them. So this is not a slam on New Hampshire, or even your pension systems, or your state legislators, or your governor. This is a problem that starts on Wall Street, that you are unfortunately on the receiving end of, and therefore implicated in. And that's the kind of thing we're here to talk about. Now, how much money ultimately is implicated here? I mean, how much money have the Chinese taken out of the stock and bond markets by issuing equity or stock and issuing bonds? After all, you issue a bond, you give somebody a piece of paper with an interest rate and a maturity date, and they give you $1 billion, $2 billion, or something like this. We have to remember that these are in effect pieces of paper in exchange for money. Best we know, something in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion to as much as $3 trillion. That's over 4 times our $700 billion defense budget. That's the kind of walking around money that seems to be in limitless supply with the Chinese. How do they compromise all of the countries in Southeast Asia, buying them up, the Cambodias, the Thailands? I mean, how do they practically own the continent of Africa? I mean, you see these guys recruiting espionage agents in our universities, things like the Confucius Institutes, the 1,000 Talents program. They have a very elaborate effort, not to mention hundreds of billions in intellectual property theft and technology theft. A massive military buildup that, as Frank pointed out, is now a peer competitor with the United States. Hypersonic weapon systems, ever more accurate ICBMs. They're constructing 5 classes of ballistic missile submarines at the same time. There's no precedent for that in the world. It's usually one at a time. I don't know that there's ever been two, much less five. So, where's the money coming from? They have $3 trillion in hard, remember, their currency is not convertible. It's not like the yen or the dollar or the euro. You know, they're trying to institute and make it a medium of exchange, the yuan or the RMB, the renminbi as it's called. But it's not near there yet. I mean, I think of the $5 trillion a day in foreign exchange, dollars settle 95, 97%. As I remember, the yuan was about 1%. They got a long way to go, fortunately, to catch up with the supremacy of the dollar as the global currency, the reserve currency of the world. Thank goodness, because every time these guys make gains, you can be sure the leverage, that crushing leverage, is at the ready. So, we had a circumstance where for 20, 25 years, the Chinese have been coming into our capital markets, enjoying this incredible free lunch program where they don't have to comply with disclosure requirements of the SEC, like their American counterparts. Forget federal securities laws, they seemingly don't apply. I heard tell that they were waived by President Obama, although I can't say that I've nailed that down, but I have heard this. Because again, you want to ask the question, what's up here? But whether it's Obama or not, it's a reality. And then, of course, there are these other issues. Human rights, our vital security interests. Since when are we positioned to underwrite this incredible array of threats against our way of life and everything we hold dear? Who was asleep at the switch? Where is the chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton? Where is the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States? And not just the current one. Where have they been over decades now? This has only gone on about, I think, 20, 25 years that the Chinese had a substantial presence in our capital markets. But you can imagine when they thought that this was offline in effect, a sacrosanct area that they could exploit, where we have no screening mechanism. We have no federal diligence. We don't have our intelligence community engaged with the SEC in trying to figure out who these folks really are. Even in the open source, much less the classified material we have access to snake check these guys. Nothing. We have it for trade. We have a committee on foreign investment in the United States that's recently been strengthened by something called the FIRMA legislation. We care about Chinese investment in the United States so they don't buy our most precious technology companies like they were able to do with impunity before, or buy land right next to a sensitive military facility. You know, we're picking up on this at long last, but even that's an imperfect system, but at least it's a system. And it's an interagency process, and we review those deals and make sure that they're consonant with U.S. national security interests. Where's the Committee on the Capital Markets, which houses over 60% of the world's liquidity? Our capital markets are larger than the rest of the world's combined. We have all the money. They are desperate for the money in dollars and are facing liquidity crises all the time. And think about the coronavirus and what that's done to them. They already had a growth rate that's been in steady decline. Look at it now. So that need for our dough is more intense than it's ever been. But where are the safeguards? Where's abiding by the rules? Why are they receiving preferential treatment? You don't have to be a hawk. You don't have to be a China basher. You don't have to have draconian solutions like saying every Chinese company needs to be delisted from US exchanges. Or these guys should all be sanctioned, no Americans should be investing in them, and there should be a complete decoupling. Now, there's some people that believe that, but from a practical point of view, I don't think that's on. So, that's not what folks like me that uncovered this problem are advocating. Because if you did, no chance of getting anything done within the executive branch or Capitol Hill. You're up against $40 to $60 trillion of funds under management on Wall Street. They don't take this kind of thing lying down. I mean, they invented the heavy-handed lobby. You can count on that. So it's not happening. But if you go with a more market approach, if you go with just a sensible set of requests, like, hey, the Chinese should comply with federal securities laws. How radical is that? Or why are they receiving preferential treatment to their American corporate counterparts? Or why don't they have to disclose that they're building and militarizing islands in the South China Sea, and they might be sanctioned someday, and it's a risk to their share value and corporate reputation, and to anybody that invests in them, and should be properly disclosed. That's what so-called material risk disclosure is about. Why not have them obey the rules? Oh no. No, they get a sweetheart deal. And that sweetheart deal is providing the wherewithal for the very predations that Frank regaled you with earlier tonight. After all, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, this is about money. You don't get very far without it, as we all know. And the Chinese are happy for us to concentrate on the trade portfolio. They can do sanction wars, tariff wars all day long, and have proved it. Well, they don't like the new scrutiny of technology. They don't like the new strengthened CFIUS, as it's called, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. They're annoyances, but they figure they can finesse it. But the one issue that they can't finesse, the one issue that's never seen the light of day, the one issue that before March of last year, when I started to go forward with our research findings, I can't find one article, one congressional hearing, one think tank agenda item, one interagency meeting of the executive branch, one cocktail conversation in Washington about the national security and human rights dimensions of China's presence in the U.S. capital markets. What? We missed that 40 to 60 trillion, did we? Or is it that it wasn't supposed to see the light of day? Because it is the mother lode. It is where China lives or dies. You want to talk about a thin cushion. These guys don't have a cushion. They have a real estate bubble that would keep us and their own leadership up at night, every night. It's so scary. They've got a debt crisis that's now 300% of GDP. And how much of that's bad loans? Lord knows. Nobody knows, except probably the Communist Party. And they're not talking. But it's got to be massive. And think of what the coronavirus is doing for those over-leveraged Chinese companies. that borrowed too much and bought city and built cities that nobody lives in and all that. There's no cash flow. There's a bailout going to happen there that just doesn't quit. So what happens to their growth rate, et cetera, et cetera? So they don't have the cushion. We think that these guys are 10 feet tall, that they're an immutable juggernaut on the geopolitical landscape of the world, that we're going to be living with for our children's 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 children, to go back to at least the Reagan sentiment, that they're going to be a permanent player. You hear people saying, well, let's see how China's doing 20 and 50 years from now. There better not be 20 to 50 years, or you're going to lose your way of life. This isn't the old days. This is a high velocity digital world. It is in fast forward, as you all know, instantaneous, globalized, digitized. Problems happen fast, not just good times. So that's not on either. Now, again, this doesn't have to be radical surgery. This doesn't have to be something that folks talk about, whether you're some China basher or whether you're just some mindless hawk or whether you are have something against the Chinese people in a racist or other way. I mean, really, that's not where we are. Any more than we thought that Russians were inferior or something. I mean, look, these are authoritarian regimes, in some cases, as more recently, totalitarian police states that are dedicated to destroying our way of life and our democratic institutions. Period. And if somebody can show me that that's not the case, I have an open mind. I'm listening. Now we can go back and talk a little bit about the Soviets, and we should, maybe, if anybody's interested. I could certainly do it in the Q&A. But I did want to preserve some time, to do that for those interested as to how that evil empire went down. And that was about cash flow. And that was about the West funding them. So as different as the Soviet Union was, is in its anemic, brittle, sort of one-lane economy that it had, oil and gas, versus this vast, diversified economy, totally integrated into the global network like China, I get their differences, unrecognizable almost differences. But there are a couple of things that are the same. These are totalitarian police states, and they are living largely off of us and our money. Unwittingly, unknowingly, undisclosed, which I have a bone to pick with the SEC about, putting it mildly, because all of us should at least have a right to know. I mean, what's up with not knowing that you're invested in a U.S. sanctioned company? Is that a material risk? Gee, would that, if I told you that you were about to invest in a U.S. sanctioned company where it's illegal for Americans to do business with a company, don't you think you might want to know that before you put your hard-earned money in there? Don't you think that, represents a kind of risk that you need to be aware of before you put your dough in there? Obviously, yes. Is any of that disclosed today? No. I mean, I seem to have a smirk on my face, but it's really not a laughing matter. I mean, it's a pathetic display. So, we got a lot of work to do here, but there's hope. I mean, as recalcitrant and determined as Wall Street is not to move on this, the 50 states can make a big difference. That's why we're going state to state. Because You can go to your state legislators, you can go to your governors, and say, out of that old movie network, which is an oldie and goodie, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm not going to be invested in ICBMs targeting my families. I'm not going to be invested in concentration camps. I mean, what the hell is this? And don't tell me that you bought an index and therefore it's not your responsibility. You made the decision to to buy that index with those Chinese companies and those Russian sanctions violators. You know, this idea that you get a free pass because it's in a Wall Street index, and that's so what? Makes it okay? Because they didn't do their homework? And they just want to collect the fees? And they don't give a damn about where your money ends up, is the truth. So, this is a matter of education, it's a matter of awareness, and fortunately, we've got a lot of ammo on our side. You know, follow the rules, please. This should be fall off a log easy, but it's not, because the biggest money in the world's in this game. And the biggest money in the world is us. And that money is yours. And therefore we have a right to safeguard it, to safeguard our country, and to safeguard our fundamental values. Thank you.